The gladiators you have seen in every film, every television series, every video game, lean, oiled, impossibly muscular, are a fantasy. A Roman fantasy, in fact. The idealized image carved onto victory monuments and painted on wealthy men's walls. Marketing material for the games, not reality. Reality looked different, ate differently, lived differently, and died far less often in the arena than you have been led to believe. This is the story of Cassian, a slave, a gladiator, a piece of property worth more alive than dead. His story is built from archaeology, Roman legal records, skeletal analysis, and the accounts of writers who actually watched the games, not writers who made films about them 2,000 years later. By the time this video is finished, everything you think you know about Roman gladiators will be either confirmed, complicated, or completely destroyed. Let's begin with the thing that surprises people most. Before we go any further, if you find yourself questioning things you thought you knew about the ancient world, that is exactly what this channel is for. Hit subscribe. Now, back to Cassian, and the first thing that will surprise you. To understand the gladiatorial system of Augustan Rome, you must first understand one thing above everything else. Gladiators were not cheap. The Roman writer and philosopher Seneca, observing the games in the 1st century AD, had noted what every lanista, every gladiatorial school owner, already knew intimately. A trained gladiator represented an enormous capital investment. Purchasing a suitable slave at market cost anywhere between 1,000 and 6,000 sestertii, depending on age, physique, and fighting background.
50 dinars for the group. Do I hear sixth? Sixth, thank you. Going once, going twice. Sold!
Training that slave to arena standard took a minimum of 3 years. Housing, feeding, clothing, and providing medical care for that slave over those 3 years added thousands more. By the time Cassian walked into his first real arena bout, his lanista, a former gladiator himself named Titus Ignatius, had invested the equivalent of a small farm in him. Titus Ignatius did not send Cassian into the arena to die. He sent him into the arena to perform, to win crowd approval, and to walk back out so he could fight again next month and earn his owner another appearance fee. The myth of constant gladiatorial death comes from a very specific source: Roman art. The wealthy Romans who commissioned mosaics and relief carvings of arena scenes wanted drama. They wanted the moment of maximum tension. They were not commissioning historical documentation. They were commissioning the ancient equivalent of a movie poster, the actual statistical reality reconstructed by historians and bioarchaeologists in the last 30 years, tells a completely different story. In 1993, archaeologists in Ephesus, modern Turkey, discovered a cemetery used exclusively for gladiators. Approximately 70 individuals. The skeletal analysis published over the following decade revealed something extraordinary. The majority of injuries found on these skeletons showed clear evidence of professional medical treatment and full healing.
Hold the line! Push! Forward!
These were not the bones of men killed in combat. These were the bones of men who fought, were wounded, were treated, recovered, and fought again. Further analysis of Roman arena contracts, preserved in Egyptian papyri from the same era, showed that the standard gladiatorial contract included specific clauses limiting the number of bouts per year, specifying rest periods and, critically, establishing financial penalties payable to the lanista if a gladiator was killed during a bout. The editor, the game's organizer, paid a much higher fee for a killed gladiator than for a defeated one. It was essentially insurance.
Try lifting it higher. That is as high as I can manage. A small fracture, it will heal.
And it made killing in the arena an expensive inconvenience rather than the expected outcome. The Roman historian Livy recorded that in the early games, death was more common, but by the Augustan era, Cassian's era, the economics had professionalized the entire system. Killing had become the exception. Survival had become the business model. One final note on a detail most people think they know. The thumbs-down gesture, the one every school child learns as the Roman death signal, is almost certainly historically inaccurate. Modern scholars now believe the actual signal was a turned or twisted thumb. The thumbs down as a symbol of death was popularized not by ancient Rome, but by a 19th century French painting. Jean-Léon Gérôme's 1872 canvas Police Verso. The Hollywood version can be traced directly to a canvas, not a coliseum. To understand why gladiators were too expensive to kill, you have to understand the scale of the system that produced them. Rome in the Augustan era was the largest slave economy in the ancient world. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 people in Italy were enslaved, a concentration far higher than the empire-wide average. In absolute numbers, that means somewhere between 2 and 3 million enslaved people on the Italian peninsula alone. These were not people born into slavery in the main. The majority had arrived through conquest. Every Roman military campaign produced slaves. Every defeated city, every overrun village, every captured soldier became property under Roman law. The campaigns of Julius Caesar alone, his 8 years of war in Gaul, produced, according to ancient sources, including Caesar's own accounts, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million enslaved people. Modern historians treat these figures cautiously, but even at the conservative end, the scale is staggering. The slave dealers who supplied the gladiatorial schools were known as mangones, a word Romans used with contempt while simultaneously making them rich. They were specialists. They understood the market for arena fighters the way a modern talent scout understands the market for athletes. They were looking for specific physical profiles, height, build, apparent aggression, evidence of prior combat experience. A Dacian prisoner who'd been a soldier in his previous life was worth significantly more at auction than a Greek accountant. Economic historians, led by Keith Hopkins in his landmark study of Roman gladiatorial economics, have argued that a successful gladiator could return several times his purchase and training cost to the lanista over a career, provided he survived. A dead gladiator earned nothing after the moment of death. Killing a gladiator was, in purely financial terms, like burning down a productive farm. This is not a sympathetic portrait of the lanista. He was not protecting Cassian because he valued Cassian's humanity. He was protecting his investment with the same cold calculation he would apply to a prize horse or a productive vineyard. But the effect, the practical day-to-day effect on Cassian's life, was the same, regardless of the motivation. He was fed, he was housed, he was healed, and he was kept alive. There is one more economic detail that the movies never mention. Gladiators were paid, not wages in the modern sense. They remained property, without legal right to accumulate or inherit wealth. But the system of bonuses, prizes, and arena fees that flowed through the lanista did, in practice, result in some successful gladiators accumulating what Romans called a peculium, a personal fund held informally, tolerated by their owners because a gladiator with something to lose fought harder to protect it. Cassian had a peculium. It was small, a handful of coins kept in a leather pouch beneath his mattress. It represented perhaps 30 days of a poor Roman's wages. But it represented something else too. It represented the first thing in 4 years that was, in any practical sense, his. And he guarded it, with a vigilance that had nothing to do with the money, and everything to do with what owning anything at all meant to a man who technically owned nothing, including himself. The gladiatorial schools of Augustan Rome employed full-time physicians. This is not a detail that appears in any Hollywood production, but it is one of the most thoroughly documented facts about the gladiatorial system. The physician Galen, one of the most important medical writers in ancient history, served as physician to a gladiatorial school in Pergamon early in his career. He later credited that experience as foundational to his anatomical knowledge. Cassian's medical care was, by the standards of the ancient world, excellent, not because Rome valued him as a human being, because Rome valued him as an investment. This is the central, the brutal paradox of Cassian's existence, and of every gladiator in Augustan Rome. The system that enslaved him also protected him. The institution that owned him also fed him, housed him, and healed his wounds. Not from compassion, from accounting. He was kept alive with the same calculation, applied to a good horse or a productive farm. The moment he ceased to be profitable, too old, too injured, too psychologically broken to perform, that calculation would change. But until then, Titus Ignatius needed Cassian breathing. What the crowd demanded, contrary to the Hollywood version, was not death. Ancient sources, including Cicero and Pliny, record the crowd frequently calling for mercy for a well-fought loser. Cassian survived his first year of bouts, not because he was the greatest fighter in Capua. He survived because he understood the business. He gave the crowd what they wanted. He kept his lanista's investment intact, and he walked back through the gate every single time. What they fed him to make that possible. That is the next thing the movies got completely wrong. In 2014, a research team from the Medical University of Vienna published a comprehensive isotopic analysis of the Ephesus gladiator bones. Isotopic analysis, the chemical examination of bone composition, can reveal with remarkable precision what a person ate over the course of their lifetime. The results were unambiguous. The Ephesus gladiators ate a diet dominated by plant protein, barley, wheat, legumes, dried vegetables. Animal protein was minimal, present, but not the foundation of the diet. The researchers noted that this aligned precisely with what Roman writers had recorded about gladiatorial diet, but which historians had largely dismissed as exaggeration or insult. The Romans called gladiators hordearii, barley men. It was partly an insult. Barley was the grain of the poor, of slaves, of animals, Wheat was the grain of citizens, but the insult contained an accurate observation. Gladiators genuinely did eat enormous quantities of barley, and the gladiatorial schools fed it to them deliberately. The deliberate fattening of gladiators was not negligence or poor nutritional understanding. It was sophisticated sports science operating on instinct rather than theory. The logic was this: a layer of subcutaneous fat beneath the skin but above the muscle, acts as a protective buffer against cuts and shallow wounds. In an era before antiseptic medicine, a surface wound that did not penetrate to muscle or organ was survivable. A wound that did penetrate was potentially fatal from infection alone. Fatter gladiators had a literal biological shield against the most common category of arena injury. The Ephesus bone analysis confirmed this. The calcium and strontium ratios in the bones, which indicate a diet heavy in plant ash supplements, showed that the schools were also deliberately mineralizing the bones to increase density and fracture resistance. Someone in the Roman gladiatorial system had worked out, through centuries of empirical observation, something close to what modern sports medicine now confirms about bone density and dietary mineral intake. Cassian ate what he was given. He had no choice in the matter. The lanista controlled every aspect of diet within the ludus: portions, ingredients, timing, supplements. This was not cruelty. It was investment management. A gladiator who ate badly was a gladiator who broke bones, bled out from shallow cuts, or fatigued in the second half of a bout. By the standards of the Roman world, a gladiator's diet was actually calorically superior to that of most free Roman citizens. A poor free Roman in Augustan, Italy might eat once a day: grain paste, a few olives, whatever could be scavenged or bought cheaply. Cassian ate 3 measured meals daily, with carefully calculated protein and carbohydrate ratios that a modern sports nutritionist would recognize as broadly sensible. There's a detail about the gladiatorial diet that the archaeological record cannot fully measure, but that Roman writers occasionally illuminate. The act of eating, communally, regularly, adequately, within the ludus, created a psychological dependency that was almost certainly deliberate. Seneca wrote with characteristic bluntness that the gladiatorial schools kept their fighters compliant, not primarily through chains, though chains existed, but through comfort, regular food, medical care. The security of knowing tomorrow's meal was guaranteed. For men who had arrived at the ludus through the trauma of conquest, piracy, or debt. Men who had known genuine starvation and genuine uncertainty. The reliable bowl of barley represented something psychologically powerful. It represented the thing slavery always weaponizes most effectively: the knowledge that things could be worse, and the fear that resistance would make them so. He ate the barley because they gave him no choice. He trained on it because it worked. And somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the discipline and the calculation, he hated what the bowl represented, with a quiet fury that 4 years of regular meals had never quite extinguished. What that fury cost him, what 4 years inside the system did to the mind of a man who remembered being free. That is the chapter the movies never touch. The Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca, a man who attended the games and wrote about them with unusual psychological candor for his era, described something in the gladiatorial schools that his contemporaries largely ignored. And he wrote of fighters who had in his observation, lost their sense of self entirely. Men who functioned with complete professional efficiency in training and in the arena, but who, in the quiet hours, had become simply absent. He was describing, with first-century vocabulary, a psychological state that modern clinical language would identify as dissociation, the gradual disconnection of the conscious self from emotional experience as a survival mechanism against repeated trauma. The historical and archaeological record is careful on the question of arena deaths. We know they were less frequent than popular imagination suggests. We do not know they were rare. A gladiator who fought a full career of 3 to 5 years would, statistically, have delivered a killing blow at least once. Probably more than once. Roman psychological literature, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, all of whom wrote about gladiators as philosophical case studies, agrees on one observation. The first kill changed a man. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but permanently. The change was not the one the crowd imagined, not a hardening into something inhuman. The Roman Stoic writers described something more precise and more disturbing. They described a man who learned in that moment that he was capable of killing a person in front of 50,000 people, and that 50,000 people found it entertaining, and that he would be required to carry that knowledge for the rest of his life, in a small cell, inside walls he could not climb. Archaeologists examining the Ephesus Gladiator cemetery found evidence of something beyond physical injury. Several skeletons showed patterns of bone stress, consistent not with combat wounds, but with the repetitive strain of obsessive, excessive training. Training beyond what any fitness regimen would require. Men who trained until their bones protested were men using physical exhaustion to manage something the bones could not record. The first kill left a mark that did not show in the arena. What helped carry it, what made endurance possible at all, was something the movies have never thought to depict. The community inside the walls. Gladiatorial schools were, by necessity, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and religiously diverse institutions. Men from every corner of the Roman world and beyond its borders trained, ate, slept, and fought alongside each other. The Roman law technically prohibited deep personal bonds between enslaved people, bonds that might form the basis of collective resistance. But Roman law could not legislate human psychology. Epigraphic evidence, inscriptions on gladiatorial tombstones, reveals something quietly extraordinary. Gladiators paid for each other's funerals. They served as each other's legal heirs. They formed what Roman documents called collegia, burial clubs, mutual aid societies, that functioned as substitute families inside the institution. Cassian's psychological survival, to the extent that it was survival and not merely endurance, depended on connections like this. Not on Roman benevolence, not on the system's occasional mercy, on the specific, irreplaceable presence of people who knew exactly what his life cost, because it cost them the same. Roman writers who documented life inside the gladiatorial schools described a consistent phenomenon on the morning of fight days. Not the wild aggression that Hollywood gives us. Not men beating their chests and sharpening their swords with bared teeth. What ancient observers actually recorded was something quieter and stranger. A focused stillness, a collective withdrawal into interior space that Roman military and philosophical writers compared to the pre-battle calm of veteran soldiers. This was not poetic description. It was precise observation. The men inside the ludus on a fight morning had all been in the arena before. They knew exactly what was coming, and the knowledge of exactly what is coming, the specific, detailed, experiential knowledge, rather than the abstract fear of the unknown, produces a psychological state that looks, from the outside, like calm. It is not calm. It is the complete concentration of every available mental resource onto a single point. For Cassian, the procession walk to the arena, repeated perhaps a dozen times over 4 years, never became ordinary, not because of fear, though fear was present, because of the specific cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously the most visible and the most legally invisible person in the street. The crowd knew his name. They knew his fight record. They had opinions about his technique, and not one of them had the slightest legal obligation to treat him as a person. Ancient sources, Seneca most precisely, but also the poet Martial, describe the gate moment, at the transition from the darkness of the tunnel into the full light and sound of the arena. Seneca wrote that this transition was, for experienced fighters, the most psychologically significant moment of the entire day. Not the bout itself, the gate. In the tunnel, the gladiator was still a private person. His thoughts were his own. His fear was his own. The moment the gate opened and the light hit, and the crowd noise became a physical force, from that moment until the bout ended, everything he felt belonged to 50,000 people. His pain was their entertainment. His courage was their afternoon. His potential death was their catharsis. The gate was the boundary between having an interior life and performing one. What happened after a successful bout is almost never depicted. The movies end on the roar of the crowd, the raised fist, as the victor's moment. The historical record describes something very different. Gladiators who survived bouts did not celebrate in the way free athletes celebrate victories. A free athlete wins something that belongs to him. Cassian won something that belonged to Titus Ignatius. The crowd's approval translated directly into the Lanesta's next booking fee. The victory was Cassian's body performing correctly. The profit was someone else's. Seneca, in one of his letters, described attending the aftermath of games and observing the fighters in the hours following, noting what he called an emptiness that was distinct from exhaustion. Modern psychology would have less difficulty naming it. It was the specific emotional flatness that follows prolonged performance under extreme stress. The systems return to baseline after hours of maximum activation, passing through a trough that sits below the normal resting state. They won. They walked back through the gate, and then they went back to the barley. Roman writers who observed gladiators with any psychological curiosity noted one consistent trait. They called it by different names: gravitas, severitas, sometimes simply silentium, seriousness, severity, silence. What they were observing, we now understand, was the long-term behavioral signature of chronic psychological stress, the flattening of emotional expression, the hypervigilance masked as calm, the narrowing of focus to the immediate and the tactical, because the larger picture, the lifetime of servitude, but the absence of any foreseeable end, was too large to look at directly without fracturing. Cassian was not unbreakable. He was broken in ways that did not show in the arena. because the arena was the one place the training had prepared him for. It was the hours between bouts, the nights in the cell, the meals in the hall, the free hours in the yard, where the weight of what his life actually was pressed down most heavily. The movies give gladiators war cries and defiant speeches. The archaeology gives them burial clubs and obsessive training patterns and tombstone inscriptions that name their friends. The difference between those two versions of the same man is the difference between what Rome wanted to see and what Rome actually created. And then, as if the psychology were not complicated enough, Rome did something to gladiators that makes the entire situation even harder to understand. It made them famous. In 2019, archaeologists working in Pompeii, preserved in volcanic ash from the eruption of 79 AD, giving us the most complete snapshot of an Augustan-era Italian city available, cataloged over 200 pieces of gladiatorial graffiti on public walls, fighter names, win records, physical descriptions, declarations of admiration that range from respectful to frankly obsessive. One inscription, translated from the Latin, reads, Celadus the Thraex, the one who makes girls sigh. Another names a fighter as the glory of the girls. These are not exceptional finds. They are representative of a pattern repeated across every excavated Roman city with an arena culture. The gladiatorial fame economy of Augustan Rome was sophisticated and commercially developed in ways that feel startlingly familiar to modern audiences. Successful fighters had their likenesses reproduced on oil lamps, perfume bottles, ceramics, jewelry, and wall paintings. These were commercial products, sold for profit by manufacturers who understood that a popular fighter's face moved merchandise. Roman children had gladiator toys. Roman men wore gladiator amulets. The historian Cassius Dio recorded that Faustina, wife of the emperor Marcus Aurelius, allegedly became obsessed with a gladiator. Whether true or invented scandal, the story's credibility with Roman audiences tells us everything about how normalized the phenomenon of gladiatorial celebrity had become. The point is not whether Faustina is guilty. The point is that Romans found it entirely believable that she could be. And yet, simultaneously, Roman law classified gladiators as infames, the dishonored, a legal category that placed them alongside prostitutes, actors, and convicted criminals as people stripped of full civic standing. An infames could not vote, could not hold office, could not give testimony in a Roman court, could not contract a legal marriage. A gladiator might have his face on 10,000 oil lamps. A senator's wife might leave her household for him. The crowd of 50,000 might chant his name, and Roman law simultaneously treated him as a person whose word meant nothing in a courtroom. This was the psychological environment Cassian navigated daily. Famous and dishonored, valuable and disposable, admired and despised, recognized everywhere and legally invisible. Roman society had constructed, in the gladiatorial system, one of the most psychologically sophisticated instruments of control ever devised. It gave the gladiator just enough: fame, food, medical care, community, occasional moments of genuine glory, to make the alternative of certain death through resistance feel irrational, and it withheld just enough: freedom, legal personhood, the right to his own name, to ensure the system never forgot what he actually was. His name was Cassian. A Roman gave him that name, and Rome put it on walls, on lamps, in the mouths of 50,000 people. We do not know what his name was before. The record does not preserve it. Deliberately, systematically, as a matter of policy. The erasure of origin names was standard practice in the Roman slave system, documented extensively in legal and administrative records. A slave's previous name represented a previous identity, a previous community, a previous self that complicated the clean legal fiction of property. Somewhere in Cassian's mind, behind the professional calm and the arena discipline and the quiet fury of 4 years of meals he did not choose, he remembered it. His actual name, in his actual language, the one no Roman ever heard. His expression is unreadable, and that unreadability is the most honest thing this story can give you. The gladiatorial games did not end quickly, they did not end cleanly, and they did not end for the reason most people assume. The standard story, the one taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, embedded in popular culture, is that Christianity ended the games. That the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity in the 4th century A.D. introduced a moral framework that found the arena incompatible with its values, and that the games were abolished accordingly. The historical reality is considerably messier, considerably more interesting, and considerably more honest about how human institutions actually end. In 325 A.D., the Emperor Constantine issued a partial edict restricting gladiatorial combat, but it applied unevenly across the empire, excluded Rome and Italy entirely, and Constantine himself continued to permit games and even wrote to grant cities the right to hold them. The gap between what Roman emperors declared and what Roman society actually did was, in this case, measured in generations. The prohibitions continued to pile up, but each one revealing how little the previous had achieved. The Emperor Theodosius banned pagan festivals including gladiatorial games in 392 and 393 A.D. Honorius closed the gladiatorial schools in 399 A.D., though beast hunts and other arena spectacles continued well past this date. By the early 5th century, multiple Christian emperors had officially abolished the arena. The arena had simply continued. The last recorded gladiatorial games in Rome took place on the 1st of January, 404 A.D., a century and a half after the first prohibition. They ended not because of legislation, and not finally because of Christian theology, but because of a monk named Telemachus. He walked into the arena during a live bout, unarmed, alone, and placed himself physically between the two fighters. The crowd, enraged at the interruption of their entertainment, stoned him to death where he stood. The Emperor Honorius, reportedly appalled by the monk's martyrdom, issued a ban that this time held. One man's death ended what the conversion of an empire could not. Whether you find that fact inspiring or devastating likely says something about what you believe about moral progress. But the games had been dying before Telemachus walked into the arena. The economic and demographic pressures of the late empire had been eroding the gladiatorial system for a century before its formal end. The endless wars of the 3rd century A.D. had disrupted the slave supply chains that fed the markets. The fiscal crises of the late empire had made the enormous expense of staging games increasingly difficult for the local elites, who traditionally funded them as a form of political investment. Gladiatorial games were, at their core, a display of surplus. You staged them when you had enough wealth to burn on spectacle, enough slaves to train as fighters, enough political stability to gather 50,000 people in one place for an afternoon. When the surplus disappeared, the games shrank, not because Rome became more moral, because Rome became poorer. Cassian lived at the peak. The Augustan era was the golden age of the gladiatorial system, the moment of maximum investment, maximum organization, maximum spectacle. Augustus himself was a devoted fan of the games. Ancient sources record that he attended frequently, watched with genuine enthusiasm, and increased both the frequency and the scale of public games during his reign. He also, with characteristic Augustan efficiency, he formalized and regulated the system that had previously been more chaotic, not from humanitarian concern, but from the same economic logic that drove everything else. Damaged merchandise was bad investment. Standardized treatment protected the supply chain. The system that Augustus built and that Cassian lived inside would outlast both of them by 4 centuries. It would be modified, challenged, regulated, prohibited, ignored, revived, and finally, gradually, incompletely, messily, abandoned. Not because Rome looked at the arena and saw what it was, but because Rome eventually ran out of the resources to maintain what it had built. Moral progress is rarely what ends systems built on human suffering. Economics ends them. Demographics ends them. War ends them. Exhaustion ends them. What moral progress does, if we are fortunate, and if we work at it, is ensure that when the system ends, we have the language and the framework to understand what it was. To look at the bones in Ephesus and say, these were people. To read the tombstone inscriptions paid for by men who had nothing to leave each other and understand what they represent. To say the name Cassian, a name a Roman gave him without asking, and remember that somewhere behind it was another name, in another language, that history did not think worth recording. Rome is gone. The Augustan Empire that Cassian lived inside, that fed him, trained him, owned him, displayed him, and refused to give him his name back, has been dust for 1,500 years. What remains is the archaeology. The bones in Ephesus with their healed fractures and their plant-based isotope signatures. See the graffiti on the Pompeii walls with the names and the size. The legal documents in Egyptian papyri with their insurance clauses and their financial penalties. The tombstones paid for by men who had nothing to leave each other except the final dignity of a marked grave. The movies gave us gladiators who were free in spirit if not in body, who found dignity in the roar of the crowd, who died beautifully, defiantly, on their own terms. The archaeology gives us something quieter, and, in its quietness, far more devastating. Men who ate barley and healed their bones and paid for each other's funerals and scratched drawings on their cell walls and carried names that weren't theirs into an arena that wasn't built for them. And survived, most of them, not through cinematic heroism, but through the daily, grinding, and unspectacular work of endurance. Cassian survived his 4 years in the ludus at Capua. He was approximately 27 years old when he was granted manumission, his freedom, granted not from conscience but from accounting. He was too old to fight profitably. The investment had been recovered. He was released. He had no money, no property, no legal standing beyond the thin technical category of freedman. He had a Roman name he hated, and a rusted gladius he had been allowed to keep as a customary parting gift. He walked out of the Ludus gates into Capua on a morning in late summer. The record does not follow him further. We hope he found, somewhere in the Campanian hills or the crowded streets of the city, something that resembled the life that had been taken from him. History, which preserved his fight record, and his ownership documents with bureaucratic efficiency did not think to record whether he was happy. Rome rarely did. The sand is gone. The crowds are gone. The Laniste and their account books and their cold financial calculations are gone. What remains is the stone that one group of men paid for so that another man would not be forgotten entirely. That instinct, to mark the grave, to say the name, to refuse the erasure, is the only thing in this entire story that Rome did not own.